He was a 44-year-old homeless Navy SEAL who had lost his home, his marriage, and precious time with his daughter, leaving him with an aging Chevrolet Tahoe, memories of brothers who never came home from Afghanistan, and Max, the loyal German shepherd who had never abandoned him. Then, on a freezing November afternoon, Daniel drove toward his late father's abandoned boat shop in Sandpoint, Idaho, hoping the inheritance might give him one last chance to rebuild his life. But on a snow-covered mountain road, an oncoming pickup lost control. Daniel swerved, crashed down an embankment, and became trapped inside his freezing SUV with no cell signal. As hypothermia began pulling him toward unconsciousness, Max refused to let him sleep, then disappeared into the storm to find help. Daniel survived, but what waited at the boat shop was even more unsettling. A forced open cabinet, missing records, and a secret message from the father Daniel believed had died disappointed in him. Before we begin, if stories of faith, loyal dogs, veterans, and second chances touch your heart, please subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Late November 2019, snow drifted across the northern Idaho highway in pale ribbons, swallowing the shoulder lines and turning the pine-covered hills beyond Spokane into a cold, silent wall. Daniel Brooks was 44, 6 feet 1, broad through the shoulders despite the weight he had lost during nearly 2 years of homelessness. His dark brown hair was cut short out of old habit, silver beginning to show at the temples, and a close beard covered a square jaw weathered by sun, cold, and too many sleepless nights. A thin scar crossed his left eyebrow. Another disappeared beneath his shirt near the ribs. His blue-gray eyes had once made younger sailors straighten when he entered a room. Now they mostly looked tired. Daniel had spent 18 years as a U.S. Navy SEAL, and although he still carried himself like a man trained to notice doors, hands, shadows, and distances, the war had changed the way he moved through ordinary life. He disliked crowded rooms, sat where he could see exits, and woke at sounds other people slept through. His left knee had never recovered properly from the blast that ended his military career. Worse were the things no surgeon could repair. His closest friend, Mikey Harris, a lean, sharp-faced SEAL with sandy hair and an incurable habit of making jokes before dangerous missions, had died in Afghanistan after years of serving beside him. Daniel had been the last man to speak to Mikey before their team moved out. 2 years later, another explosion killed 2 more men Daniel knew and sent him home alive. People called that survival. Daniel sometimes thought it felt more like being left behind. Beside him sat Max, a 9-year-old male German shepherd with a powerful chest, black and tan coat, one nicked ear, and gray spreading around his muzzle. Max had once worked as a military service dog, disciplined, observant, and almost unnervingly sensitive to changes in Daniel's breathing. After retirement, Daniel adopted him. Since then, Max had slept beside him in cheap motel rooms, veterans' shelters, parking lots, and the back of the aging Chevrolet Tahoe they were driving now. Daniel had lost his job, his savings, and finally his marriage to Melissa Brooks, a tall, composed brunette in her early 40s, whose careful manner and need for order had hardened during years of watching Daniel withdraw from the world. Melissa had eventually taken control of nearly every household account because Daniel stopped paying attention. After the divorce, she received primary custody of their 11-year-old daughter, Emily, a slight brown-haired girl with hazel eyes, a stubborn chin like her father's, and the habit of drawing tiny dogs in the margins of her schoolwork. Daniel still remembered the court's description of him: unstable. The word had followed him longer than any medal. His lawyer had finally told him that wanting more time with Emily was not enough. He needed steady work, stable housing, and months of proof. That was why Daniel was driving toward Sandpoint and the old boat repair shop his father had left behind near Lake Pend Oreille. Robert Brooks had been dead 14 months. He had been a heavy-set, rough-handed mechanic with iron gray hair, a thick mustache, and a manner that could sound harsh even when he was worried. He had loved by repairing things instead of discussing feelings. Their last argument had ended with Robert telling Daniel that he was letting other people make his decisions for him. Daniel, already raw from divorce and shame, had answered, "I survived a war, Dad. I don't need you telling me how to live." Robert had only said, "I know." Daniel had heard disappointment. Since then, he had wondered whether there had been something else in those 2 words. Snow thickened after 4 in the afternoon. Max shifted restlessly. "We're fine," Daniel muttered, although he had learned never to dismiss the dog completely. Then a pine tree appeared across part of the road ahead. A pickup coming the opposite direction swerved, lost traction, and slid sideways into Daniel's lane. There was no time to brake cleanly. Daniel turned the wheel. The Tahoe dropped off the shoulder, spun down the embankment, and struck a tree hard enough to erase the next few seconds. He woke to cold air and Max whining. Broken rear glass glittered across the cargo area. Daniel's left leg was pinned awkwardly beneath the distorted dashboard, his old knee screaming but still responsive. Max crawled toward him, shaken but apparently unhurt. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, touching his neck before reaching for his phone. "No service. 12% battery." Outside, falling snow was already softening the vehicle's tracks. From the road above, the Tahoe was almost invisible among the trees. The engine was dead. Snow blew through the shattered window and melted into Daniel's clothes. He began shivering violently. Later, the shivering weakened. Daniel knew enough field medicine to understand why that frightened him more. His body was not recovering. It was losing the argument. Warmth began creeping through him, false and inviting. His eyelids lowered. He thought of Mikey's grin. His father, waiting in the shop. Then Emily asking during their last visit, "When are you going to have a home, Dad?" Daniel had promised. "Soon, kiddo." Max barked sharply. Daniel closed his eyes anyway. The dog seized his sleeve and jerked until Daniel's head lifted. "Stop!" Max pulled again, then pressed his muzzle against Daniel's face. Daniel understood. Max was not trying to drag him free. He was keeping him awake. Daniel looked toward the road through the broken glass. One option remained. "Max, go find." The German shepherd froze. "Go find." Max whined. Daniel forced command back into his voice. "Go." Max climbed through the broken window, ran several yards, then turned back. Daniel managed a weak smile. "I'll be here." The dog disappeared uphill into the storm. Daniel did not know how long he remained conscious. Somewhere above, county snowplow driver Tom Reynolds, a stocky 58-year-old widower with a red beard going white, and the practical patience of a man who had spent 30 winters clearing mountain roads, saw a German shepherd standing in his lane. Max refused to move. He barked at Tom's door, ran toward the embankment, returned, and barked again. Tom followed. Rescuers found Daniel barely responsive. Max had found help in time. 2 days later, after treatment for dangerous hypothermia, a mild concussion, bruising, and an aggravated knee injury, Daniel walked out of the hospital on crutches. Max launched himself toward him, whining so loudly that a nurse laughed. Daniel dropped painfully to one knee and buried both hands in the dog's fur. Years earlier, Daniel had helped Max leave a combat zone after the dog's handler could no longer continue serving with him. Now Max had brought Daniel back. 3 days later, they finally reached Robert's boat shop outside Sandpoint. Daniel expected dust, cold, and memories. Instead, Max stopped inside the doorway and growled. A filing cabinet had been emptied across the floor. The rear lock had been forced. Robert's steel document box was gone. Then Max scratched at a loose board beneath the old workbench. Daniel pried it free and found a brass key wrapped in a folded note. He recognized his father's handwriting. "If Melissa tells you I gave up on you, don't believe her. Find the Evelyn file." Daniel read it twice. Then he noticed something that made no sense. The dust around the hiding place was old, but the fingerprints on the key were fresh. Frank Miller was the only person Daniel could think of who might know what Robert had meant by the Evelyn file. He lived less than 10 minutes from the boat shop in a low cedar-sided house near the edge of Sandpoint, where snow had gathered along the porch rail and a rusted outboard motor sat beneath a tarp beside the garage. Frank was 69, thick through the chest despite his age, with a square, weathered face, pale blue eyes, iron gray hair combed straight back, and a white beard trimmed close around a mouth that rarely wasted words. 30 years of repairing engines with Robert had left his hands broad, scarred, and permanently dark around the nails. He had once been easygoing with nearly everyone according to Daniel's father, but the death of his wife from cancer 8 years earlier had made him quieter and less patient with excuses. He still helped neighbors without being asked, though he preferred to complain while doing it. When Frank opened the door and saw Daniel leaning on crutches with Max standing close beside him, his brows lifted. "Heard you two tried to get yourselves killed before you even reached town." Daniel shifted his weight off the injured knee. Didn't take. Frank looked at Max, who stared back with the solemn dignity of a dog that had recently proven his professional value. One of you has sense, then. Daniel nodded toward Max. Obviously not me. Max sneezed. Frank's mouth twitched. Come inside before Idaho finishes what the ditch started. The house smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and machine oil that had somehow followed Frank home from decades at the shop. Daniel sat at the kitchen table while Max lowered himself beside his chair, stiff from the crash and from age. Daniel placed Robert's note between them but kept the brass key in his pocket. The fresh fingerprints on it had bothered him through most of the night. He had wiped nothing, touched only the edges, and wrapped it in a clean handkerchief before coming here. Frank read the note once. His humor disappeared. Evelyn, he said. That old bastard actually used the name. Daniel watched him. You know it. Frank nodded slowly. Evelyn was not a person. It was an 18-foot aluminum fishing boat Robert had bought cheaply after a marina bankruptcy nearly 15 years earlier. The hull was sound, the engine was gone, and Robert had always claimed he would restore it when the world ran out of other things to fix. It never had. The boat now sat in the north storage building behind the main shop. Why would he hide records in a boat? Daniel asked. Frank rubbed a thumb over one of his scarred knuckles. Your father trusted metal more than filing cabinets. Metal didn't gossip. Daniel almost smiled, but Frank had already gone still. There's something else. 3 weeks after Robert died, Melissa had come to the shop. At the time, Daniel and Melissa were separated, but not yet legally divorced. She had told Frank that Daniel asked her to retrieve estate papers and old financial records. Because Melissa was still Daniel's wife and had handled most of their household finances for years, Frank let her inside. She stayed almost 2 hours. Was she alone? Daniel asked. As far as I saw. What did she take? Don't know. She had a leather document case when she left. Could have brought it in empty. Could have taken papers. I didn't check. Frank's jaw tightened. I should have. Daniel looked toward the window, where snow moved sideways past the glass. Anger rose quickly, hot enough to make the hospital bruises feel distant. Melissa had been inside his father's shop, while Daniel could barely force himself to drive past the Sandpoint exit. He hated the thought of her opening Robert's drawers, touching his tools, deciding which papers mattered. Then another thought stopped him. Was the shop damaged afterward? Frank looked at him. No. Not then. Daniel frowned. The forced lock and emptied cabinet from yesterday might have happened later. That meant Melissa's visit did not explain everything. Frank leaned back, because she wasn't the first one asking questions. About a week before Melissa came, a man had arrived in a silver sedan carrying a leather portfolio. Frank remembered him because he looked too polished for the shop. Early 50s, tall and narrow, clean-shaven, with thinning blonde hair, rimless glasses, and a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Robert's first truck. He introduced himself only as a representative of Northridge Asset Management, a regional property firm. He asked about original land records, easements, and whether Robert had stored signed transfer documents outside the courthouse file. Frank disliked him immediately, not because he was rude, but because he was too careful. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Before leaving, the man said, If Daniel Brooks finds the originals before the transfer is completed, this becomes unnecessarily complicated. Frank had remembered the wording because Robert had been dead less than a month, yet the stranger spoke as though Daniel's absence were something already factored into a plan. Daniel felt the room narrow around him. Robert had left the shop to him in the will, but Daniel had never finished probate. During the worst months after the separation, he ignored certified letters, missed deadlines, and let Melissa forward anything that looked financial to attorneys or accountants. The property carried overdue taxes and an old secured loan Robert had taken out during a bad winter at the marina. Daniel had known vaguely that paperwork existed. He had simply been too exhausted to understand it. Everybody knew I wasn't paying attention, he said. Frank's expression hardened. Your father didn't think you were stupid. No? He thought you were tired. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to be true. Frank stood, walked to a narrow cabinet, and returned with an old photograph. Robert sat outside the boat shop in it, heavier than Daniel remembered him near the end, his iron gray mustache bright against his weathered face, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug. Behind him was Daniel's old pickup. This was years ago, Frank said. Saturday afternoon. You used to come down twice a month. Daniel traced the edge of the picture with his thumb. Frank continued more quietly. Last summer, when Robert got sick, he started sitting outside every Saturday around 3. Daniel looked up. Why? Frank's eyes held his. That was about when you used to arrive. Something inside Daniel tightened. Frank told him that whenever tires crunched on the gravel road, Robert would stop whatever he was doing and look toward the entrance. Sometimes he even stood. Toward the end, standing took effort. He knew I wasn't coming, Daniel said. Frank shook his head. No, you knew you weren't coming. He kept hoping you were wrong. Daniel lowered his head. Max rose without command and pressed his broad muzzle into Daniel's palm. His touch was warm, deliberate. Frank watched them. He always do that? When I'm close to saying something, I'll regret. Smart dog. Daniel rubbed the gray fur around Max's muzzle. Too smart for his owner. Frank exhaled. Robert was angry with you, Danny. Hurt too. I'm not going to turn him into a saint because he died. But he never stopped waiting. Daniel had spent 14 months imagining his father's final opinion of him as a closed door, disappointed son, failed husband, man who came home from war but could not hold together ordinary life. Waiting was worse in a different way. Waiting meant Robert had left the door open. On the drive back, Daniel stopped at a turnout above Lake Pend Oreille. The lake stretched dark beneath the winter clouds, mountains fading into snow beyond it. Max watched him from the passenger seat. Daniel opened his phone and found Emily's photograph. She was smiling, with one front tooth slightly crooked, holding a drawing of a dog that looked suspiciously like Max with enormous ears. Daniel studied her face. Don't start, he told Max. Max stared. Daniel swallowed. Yeah, I know. He put the phone away. We still have her. Max's tail struck the seat once. Then Daniel looked toward the north end of the lake, where Robert's shop waited. Melissa had searched it. A stranger had asked about original documents. Someone else might have broken in later, and Robert had hidden an answer inside a boat no one had touched in years. Daniel started the engine. For the first time since leaving Spokane, he was no longer thinking about whether he deserved another chance. He was wondering who had been counting on him never coming back. The morning after Daniel spoke with Frank, the North Storage Building stood under a hard crust of snow, its corrugated roof ticking softly as weak sunlight touched the frozen metal. Daniel unlocked the side door, Max slipping in ahead of him, and immediately smelled old gasoline, lake water, mouse droppings, and the particular dry odor of machinery left untouched too long. The Evelyn occupied the far end beneath a gray canvas cover, an 18-foot aluminum fishing boat resting crookedly on a trailer with one flat tire. Robert had once painted the name by hand along the stern in faded navy letters. Daniel had forgotten how stubborn his father could be about old things. Robert believed most machines deserved one more repair before anyone gave up on them. Daniel wondered, not for the first time, whether the old man had applied the same rule to people. He searched the obvious places first: the storage compartments, the empty battery box, beneath the bench seats, inside a cracked tackle locker. Robert had been methodical but rarely complicated. An hour passed before Daniel's injured knee began throbbing beneath the brace. Max, meanwhile, worked without complaint. The old German shepherd moved slowly now, nose traveling along the lower hull, pausing whenever a scent interested him. Near the stern, Max stopped and scratched once at a narrow section of plywood installed beneath the rear bench. Daniel crouched carefully. 4 screws held the panel in place, but only 3 were rusted. The 4th had been replaced more recently. You see everything, don't you? Daniel murmured. Max gave him the patient look of a creature accustomed to doing the thinking for both of them. Behind the panel sat a capped aluminum tube wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were county maps, tax receipts, copies of loan agreements, and a narrow black notebook filled with Robert's blocky handwriting. Daniel carried everything to the shop office and spread it across the workbench. The story emerged slowly. During a severe downturn at the marina years earlier, Robert had borrowed against part of the property to keep the repair business alive. He had paid down most of the debt, but one parcel near the water remained tied to the loan. After Robert's death, documents had been prepared transferring Daniel's interest in that parcel to Northridge Asset Management. The transfer form listed Daniel Brooks as consenting heir. His name appeared at the bottom in dark blue ink. Daniel stared at the signature. It looked close enough to fool someone who had seen his handwriting only a few times. The long downward stroke in the B was almost right. The angle of the final S was not. Daniel always crossed the capital D in Brooks's accompanying initials with a quick horizontal slash, a habit left over from signing equipment logs in the Navy. Whoever had signed this had copied the appearance of his name, not the movement behind it. His first impulse was immediate and ugly. Call Melissa, ask what she had done, make her answer before she could prepare. He already had the phone in his hand when Max barked once from beneath the desk. Daniel looked at him. That wasn't a vote. Max kept staring. Daniel breathed through his nose, then put the phone down. Instead, he called Rachel Coleman, the attorney handling his custody case, and now helping him untangle the estate. Rachel was 47, medium height, lean with straight auburn hair cut bluntly at her jaw, gray-green eyes, and a face made more severe by the rectangular glasses she wore when reading. She had spent 15 years in family law after watching her own parents destroy each other through a bitter divorce, and that history had made her unusually intolerant of emotional decisions disguised as strategy. With clients, she could be blunt enough to sound cold, but Daniel had learned that her bluntness usually meant she intended to keep him from making expensive mistakes. "This isn't my signature," he said. "I heard you." "Then we confront them." "No." Daniel clenched his jaw. Rachel continued. "We get the recorded deed history, notarization records, the probate file, and whatever Northridge submitted, we verify before we accuse." "I know how I sign my own name." "And I believe you. A judge still needs more than that." Daniel looked at Robert's notebook. "What do I do until then?" "Follow the paper." That sentence became the rhythm of the next several weeks. Daniel moved into the small apartment above the shop rather than spending another night in the Tahoe. The space had one narrow bedroom, a kitchenette with a stove older than Emily, and windows overlooking the frozen edge of Lake Pend Oreille. His knee improved slowly, enough that he traded the crutches for a cane on bad days. Through Frank, he found part-time work with a marina maintenance company run by Luis Ortega, a broad-shouldered 52-year-old former commercial fisherman with sun-browned skin, salt and pepper hair, a trimmed goatee, and the quiet habit of judging people by whether they showed up when promised. Years earlier, Luis had lost a younger brother in a boating accident, and since then, he had become almost obsessive about safety. He gave Daniel lighter assignments at first, inventory, dock inspections, winter equipment checks, but never treated him like he was fragile. "If you can't lift it, don't lift it," Luis told him on the first day. "I'm hiring judgment, not heroics." Daniel liked him immediately. At night, Daniel worked on the spare room upstairs. He found a second-hand bed frame, sanded down an old desk, and built 2 shelves from leftover cedar boards. He nearly painted the walls gray until he remembered Emily once saying gray made every room look like school detention. He chose a warm cream instead. It was a small decision, but it surprised him how much it mattered. For years, other people had made practical choices around him. Now, Daniel was choosing the color of a room because his daughter might someday sleep there. One afternoon, while removing a bent bracket from a dock ladder, a steel wrench slipped from his hand and struck the concrete floor. The sharp crack echoed through the shop. Daniel froze. The room vanished. For a handful of seconds, there was only dust, heat, the metallic taste of fear, and Mikey shouting something Daniel could no longer remember clearly. His chest tightened. His hands went numb. He knew where he was. Yet some deeper part of him did not believe it. Max crossed the room immediately. The dog did not bark or paw at him. He simply pressed his shoulder against Daniel's good leg and stayed there. Daniel lowered himself to one knee and buried a hand in the thick fur along Max's neck. "Idaho," he whispered. Max leaned harder. "Lake Pend Oreille, Robert's shop." "Not there." His breathing gradually slowed. That evening, Daniel searched one of Robert's old desk drawers for spare screws and found a photograph beneath a stack of receipts. Daniel was 25 in the picture, standing rigid in uniform beside Robert before his first overseas deployment. Robert looked younger, heavier, his dark mustache not yet gray, one hand gripping Daniel's shoulder as though embarrassed to hug him. On the back, in Robert's handwriting, were 4 words: "Bring my boy home." Daniel sat alone at the desk while Max slept near his boots. For years, Daniel had believed coming home meant surviving the flight back to American soil. Looking at those words now, he wondered whether Robert had spent the rest of his life waiting for another kind of return. Daniel turned the photograph over once more. Under Robert's 4 words, almost hidden along the bottom edge, was a second line written in much fainter ink. "If I'm not here when he does, Evelyn knows why." 6 weeks after Daniel reached Sandpoint, morning snow clung to the courthouse steps in thin white seams. He stood outside with Rachel Coleman beside him and understood the weakness of his case before either attorney spoke. He had changed, but the calendar had not yet had enough time to prove it. Daniel had done nearly everything Rachel asked. He had steady part-time work with Luis, a functioning apartment above Robert's shop, a written payment arrangement for the overdue property taxes, and a finished bedroom waiting for Emily. He had even replaced the cheap second-hand mattress after lying on it himself and deciding no 11-year-old should be punished for her father's finances. Yet 6 weeks of responsible decisions sat on one side of the scale. Nearly 2 years of unstable housing, interrupted employment, unanswered paperwork, and missed opportunities sat on the other. The interim hearing was overseen by Judge Margaret Holloway, a 61-year-old woman with short silver blonde hair, fair skin, narrow brown eyes, and a calm face that rarely revealed which argument she believed. She had spent more than 2 decades in family court and had developed a reputation for distrusting dramatic promises from either parent. Years earlier, according to Rachel, Judge Holloway had presided over a custody case in which both parents weaponized their child against each other. Since then, she had become almost severe about separating adult grievances from a child's needs. Melissa sat across the room in a dark green jacket, posture straight, hands folded. Daniel knew that stillness. She became quieter when frightened, not louder. Her attorney, Charles Whitaker, was 54, tall and spare, with carefully parted gray hair, a long, angular face, and a clean-shaven jaw. His voice was soft enough that people leaned forward to hear him, a courtroom habit that made his questions seem reasonable even when they were cutting. Charles had built his career representing financially complicated divorces, and he rarely attacked a person directly when a document could do it more effectively. That morning, he had plenty of documents. Daniel's employment gaps, motel receipts, months without a permanent address, missed financial notices. Then Charles placed several printed messages before the judge. One sentence was highlighted. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." Daniel remembered the night immediately. He had been sleeping in the Tahoe outside Spokane. Max had been sick with a fever. Rain had leaked through a failing door seal, and Emily had not answered his call. Daniel had typed the message to Melissa shortly after midnight. He had not wanted to die. He had simply been exhausted by living one emergency away from losing everything else. Inside a courtroom, however, exhaustion looked different on paper. Charles did not exaggerate. That made it worse. "Were you emotionally overwhelmed when you wrote this?" "Yes." "Were you living in your vehicle?" "Yes." "Were you steadily employed?" "No." Daniel felt the old instinct to explain every answer. Rachel had warned him against it. Answer what is asked. Do not turn shame into a speech. The investigation into Robert's property records did not help yet. Rachel had obtained preliminary records suggesting irregularities, but the disputed signature had not been formally authenticated, and the complete chain of documents from North Ridge had not arrived. Suspicion could not become stability merely because Daniel believed it would eventually prove important. Judge Holloway acknowledged his recent progress. Then she kept the temporary arrangement unchanged. Melissa retained primary physical custody. Daniel's existing parenting time continued while the court waited for longer evidence of stability. No one used the word lose. Daniel heard it anyway. That afternoon, Emily came to the shop for their scheduled visit. She arrived carrying a purple backpack almost as large as her torso and immediately complained that the cream walls in her room were too responsible. Daniel offered to let her choose one wall color if it did not glow in the dark. Emily considered this like a treaty negotiation. They made grilled cheese sandwiches. Emily worked through math homework at Robert's old kitchen table while Max slept beneath it, occasionally opening one eye whenever cheese moved within possible falling distance. She told Daniel about a classmate whose hamster had chewed through a headphone cable during an online assignment. What happened? She blamed her brother. Smart hamster. Dad. What? Never confess without counsel. Emily laughed. For 2 hours, Daniel almost forgot the courthouse. Then Melissa's car arrived. Emily became quiet while putting on her coat. Dad? Yeah, kiddo? She kept looking at the zipper. Are you going to leave again? The question struck harder than the ruling. Daniel lowered himself carefully onto one knee. His injured leg protested, but he stayed there until they were eye level. No. You promise? Daniel had spent years distrusting promises. In Afghanistan, men promised to meet for breakfast after missions that some of them never returned from. After leaving the Navy, Daniel promised himself he would be fine. He promised Melissa things would improve. He promised Emily he would have a home soon. Promises had always sounded like debts to the future, so he chose his words carefully. I promise I'll keep showing up. Emily studied him. Not forever. Not everything will be fixed. Not I'll win. Just showing up. She wrapped both arms around his neck. Before leaving, she crouched beside Max and held his graying face between her hands. Thank you for saving Dad. Max licked her cheek. Daniel looked toward the window until he trusted his voice again. That night, Max did not finish dinner. Daniel noticed because Max had once attempted to steal a frozen hamburger through its wrapper. By morning, the German shepherd struggled to rise. His hind quarters trembled, and his right rear leg barely carried weight. Daniel drove him immediately to Dr. Hannah Pierce, a 40-year-old veterinarian with curly dark blonde hair, freckled skin, practical blue eyes, and the sturdy build of someone accustomed to lifting frightened animals. Hannah spoke gently to animals and bluntly to owners. She had become especially attentive to aging working dogs after losing her first search and rescue Labrador to degenerative joint disease, an experience that taught her how easily loyal animals concealed pain. The examination brought one relief and one truth: no tumor, no new fracture. But Max had significant arthritis through his hips and rear legs, worsened by age, years of work, cold weather, and likely the strain surrounding Daniel's accident. He's been hiding it, Hannah said. Daniel looked at Max. Yeah, we're good at that. Medication, imaging, follow-up care, and joint management would cost almost exactly what Daniel had set aside for his next property tax payment. Hannah showed him the estimate. You don't have to decide this second. Daniel did. Treat him. She looked at him. You're sure? Daniel rested his hand between Max's ears. He went up a mountain in a snowstorm because I told him to find somebody. He pushed the estimate back. Treat him. That evening, Max slept on a blanket beside Daniel's bed. Daniel removed the old collar so it would not bother him. Beneath the worn leather hung a scratched metal tag Daniel had engraved years earlier. Max, bring him home. Daniel ran his thumb over the words. How many times, buddy? Max opened one tired brown eye. How many times do you have to bring me home? The dog slowly placed one paw across Daniel's wrist. Daniel swallowed. Okay. He rested his forehead against Max's. This time I bring you. The following morning, Daniel called the county tax office and renegotiated the next payment date rather than simply missing it. Then he went to work. That evening, he gave Max his medication and fixed the loose drawer in Emily's desk. The next morning, he did it again. The court ruling had not changed. The debt had not disappeared. Max had not become young. But on the fourth morning, Daniel woke before the alarm and found Max standing beside the door with his leash in his mouth. The old dog's rear leg still trembled. He wanted to walk anyway. Daniel stared at him for a moment, then reached for his coat. Yeah, he whispered. Me too. A week after the hearing, Lake Pend Oreille began freezing along its quietest edges, and Daniel had learned that rebuilding a life rarely announced itself with anything dramatic. Most mornings still began with Max's medicine, a stiff knee, cold coffee, and another ordinary decision not to disappear. Emily spent Saturday at the shop. Daniel had expected the court's ruling to make her withdrawn, but 11-year-olds possessed a strange ability to carry heartbreak and boredom in the same backpack. By noon, she had complained about Daniel's pancakes, reorganized the books in her room according to a system she refused to explain, and informed him that Max's medication smelled like haunted cheese. Max, whose treatment had eased some of the stiffness in his hips, followed her from room to room at a dignified walk, accepting pieces of turkey whenever Daniel pretended not to notice. Watching them, Daniel felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness exactly, because happiness still frightened him when it arrived too quickly, but the beginning of trust in an ordinary future. Melissa's car appeared shortly before 5. Emily pulled on her coat, then stopped with one arm halfway through a sleeve. "Dad, I forgot." She dug through a small inner pocket and produced a brass key tied to a faded blue cord. Daniel's breath caught. It resembled the key he had found beneath Robert's workbench, though this one was slightly longer and worn smooth around the teeth. "Where did you get that?" "Grandpa." Daniel stared at her. "Grandpa Robert." Emily gave him the patient look children reserved for adults asking unnecessary questions. "How many grandpas named Robert do I have?" Despite himself, Daniel laughed. "Fair point." She explained that Robert had given it to her during their final visit, months before his death. Daniel remembered that day with uncomfortable clarity. Robert had already lost weight, his work shirts hanging loose around his shoulders, but he had insisted on taking Emily into the workshop alone, while Daniel waited outside after another tense conversation. Daniel had assumed his father wanted private time with his granddaughter. "What did he tell you?" Emily frowned, searching memory rather than meaning. "He said not to give it to you just because you asked." Daniel blinked. "He said to wait until you came back here and stayed." That sounded painfully like Robert. "How did you know I stayed?" Emily glanced around her finished room, then toward Max's medicine lined beside the refrigerator. "You have groceries." Daniel laughed again, softer this time. Emily added, "And my socks are still here from last week." Apparently permanence could be measured in groceries and abandoned socks. After Melissa picked her up, Daniel returned to Robert's workbench. The first key had opened an old drawer built into the underside, but the new one fit nothing Daniel had already found. Max settled nearby while Daniel searched more carefully. Eventually, his fingers discovered 2 bolt heads beneath the rear edge of the bench. A narrow steel cabinet had been mounted against the wall and disguised behind a removable panel. The key turned. Daniel opened the door, expecting another packet of deeds. Instead, he found a life. Robert's old machinist badge lay beside Daniel's first Navy photograph. There was a folded American flag from a retirement ceremony, several postcards Daniel had sent from overseas, and a photograph of Mikey sitting on Robert's dock years ago with a beer in one hand and a ridiculous straw hat on his head. Daniel had forgotten that weekend completely. Seeing Mikey smiling rather than dying hit him with such force that he had to sit down. Below the photographs was a new leather collar. Max lifted his head when Daniel removed it. "You had an inheritance too, apparently." Max sniffed the collar and sneezed. "Show some gratitude." At the bottom of the cabinet sat a small digital voice recorder. Daniel stopped joking. A strip of masking tape across it carried one word in Robert's handwriting: "Danny." He pressed play. For several seconds there was only breathing. Then Robert's voice filled the workshop, thinner and rougher than Daniel remembered. "Danny, if you're hearing this, apparently I still have to talk to you the complicated way." Daniel laughed before he could stop himself. Robert had always complained about people who left long messages. Then the recording changed. "I owe you an apology." Daniel went still. Robert said he had spent most of his life believing a good man absorbed pain without spreading it around. His own father had survived the Korean War and returned convinced that fear belonged behind locked doors. Robert had inherited that rule and passed it to his son without realizing it. "I thought I was teaching you strength," Robert said. "Maybe I just taught you how to hide when you were hurting." Daniel lowered his eyes. Max rose and came closer. Robert spoke about Mikey next. He knew more than Daniel realized. He knew Daniel still replayed the mission, searching for a decision that might have changed the ending. Robert had once watched his son sit through an entire Thanksgiving dinner, barely speaking because Mikey had loved Thanksgiving and was no longer there to complain about dry turkey. "You carry those men like putting them down would mean forgetting them," Robert said. "It won't." The recording went quiet for a moment. "You don't honor the dead by slowly joining them." Daniel shut his eyes. His hand found Max's neck without looking. Robert's voice continued. "If Mikey walked through that door right now, would he thank you for sleeping in your truck, for missing Emily, because you're ashamed she might see you struggling?" Daniel's throat tightened. "No," he whispered. Max pressed against him. Then Robert said something Daniel had waited 14 months to hear without knowing he was waiting. "I was wrong too." Robert admitted he had mistaken Daniel's absence for rejection. Every missed Saturday became evidence that his son no longer needed him. Pride prevented Robert from saying the simplest thing. "Come home anyway." Maybe you weren't staying away because you didn't love me, he said. Maybe you just didn't know how to come back. Daniel covered his mouth. The workshop blurred. Robert spoke again, weaker now. Don't teach Emily that loving somebody means becoming smaller so they won't leave. Don't teach her. Silence is the price of keeping a family together. I taught you enough bad lessons already. Daniel laughed through tears. Then came a long pause. And, Danny? Daniel leaned closer to the recorder. I never gave up on you. The recording ended. For a long time, nothing moved except the snow beyond the windows. Daniel had spent 14 months remembering his father through one argument. Now Robert had given him another ending. Max rested his graying muzzle on Daniel's knee. Daniel wiped his face, picked up the unused leather collar, and fastened it gently around the old dog's neck. The old man bought this for you. Max shook himself, making the new metal tag strike softly against the buckle. Daniel smiled. Then he turned the tag over. Robert had engraved something on the back. Not Max's name, just 3 words. Stay with him. Daniel stared at them until his eyes filled again. Robert had known exactly which one of them would understand the assignment. 3 months after Daniel returned to Sandpoint, Rachel called him before sunrise and said the records were finally complete. Daniel was upstairs measuring a shelf for Emily's room, while Max slept beside the heater, his new collar resting against the gray fur of his neck. Daniel put down the tape measure. Whose signature was it? Rachel paused. That answer is more complicated than you want it to be. By 10 that morning, Daniel sat across from her with copies of the probate file, notarization records, correspondence from North Ridge, and the original transfer packet recovered through the county. The conclusion was clear enough. Several documents used to advance the proposed transfer of Robert's waterfront parcel were invalid. Daniel had never signed them, but Melissa had not forged his name. North Ridge had assembled portions of the transfer while Robert's estate remained unresolved, and Daniel was effectively absent from probate. The signature attached to one document appeared to have been copied from an older authorization in another file, then incorporated into paperwork, as though Daniel had approved the transaction. The matter would require separate legal correction, but Rachel warned him against turning uncertainty into an accusation. What they could prove about Melissa was narrower. She had known North Ridge wanted to move forward with the property. She had signed 2 statements confirming financial information and representing that Daniel was unlikely to contest the disposition despite having no authority to make that decision for him. More importantly, she never told Daniel. Daniel expected Vindication to feel warm. Instead, it felt hollow. He remembered every hour he had spent imagining Melissa at Robert's desk, forging his name. Anger had made the story easy. She was the thief. He was the victim. Robert had seen the danger. Daniel had finally uncovered it. Real life refused to arrange itself that neatly. Rachel arranged a formal meeting rather than allowing Daniel to confront Melissa alone. Melissa arrived without Charles for the first discussion, looking more tired than Daniel remembered. For years, he had thought of her composure as effortless. Now he noticed the faint lines around her eyes and the way she twisted her wedding ring finger, even though the ring had been gone for more than a year. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel asked. Melissa looked at the documents. Because I didn't think you were coming back. To Sandpoint? To anything. The answer hurt because there had been a time when it was probably fair. Melissa said the property taxes were accumulating, the estate letters went unanswered, and North Ridge presented the sale as a way to prevent another debt from swallowing what little value remained. She believed Daniel would leave the estate unresolved until someone else was forced to deal with it. So you dealt with it for me. I had been dealing with things for you for years. There was no triumph in her voice, only exhaustion. Daniel wanted to argue. Then he remembered unopened bills on the kitchen counter, forms Melissa had placed in front of him while he stared through them. Nights when she asked whether he had called someone, and he said tomorrow. Her fear had slowly become control. His withdrawal had helped teach her that control was necessary. Neither fact erased the other. You had no right to speak for me, Daniel said. Melissa nodded after a long silence. No, I didn't. It was the closest thing to an apology he expected that day. Understanding her did not mean forgiving everything. Daniel could admit how his absence had shaped their marriage without accepting what Melissa had done with that absence. For the first time, he could hold both truths at once. By the next custody hearing, Daniel had been working steadily for months. The tax plan remained current. His apartment had passed the home assessment. Emily had slept there during permitted visits without incident. Max's arthritis treatment was consistent, and Daniel had begun attending a local veterans peer support group twice a month. The group met in the back room of a community center and consisted mostly of men who had learned much later than they should have that silence was not a medical treatment. When Judge Holloway entered the courtroom, Daniel did not feel confident. He felt prepared. Charles again raised Daniel's history. This time, Daniel did not experience each fact as an accusation he needed to escape. Were you homeless? Yes. Did you lose employment? Yes. Were you emotionally overwhelmed during that period? Yes. Charles produced the old message again. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Daniel looked at it. 3 months earlier, the sentence had embarrassed him. Now it simply belonged to a man who had been hurting. I wrote that. Charles waited. I was exhausted. My marriage was ending. I had no stable home, and I was afraid I was losing my daughter. Would you describe yourself as stable at that time? No. Rachel glanced toward him, but Daniel continued only when permitted. I wasn't stable. Pretending otherwise now wouldn't make me a better father. Judge Holloway watched him carefully. Daniel drew a slow breath. I used to think surviving when other men didn't meant I owed them my suffering. I thought if I stopped hurting, maybe I was leaving them behind. His eyes briefly lowered. I was wrong. Charles asked whether 3 months could erase 2 years. No, Daniel said. That answer seemed to surprise him. Then why should the court change anything? Because I'm not asking the court to erase those years. I'm asking it to look at what I'm doing now and let me keep proving it. Near the end, Judge Holloway folded her hands. Mr. Brooks, what exactly are you asking this court to give you? Daniel had rehearsed several answers. None felt right anymore. He looked at Melissa. Once he had wanted custody to prove she had been wrong about him. Now he saw Emily's mother, controlling at times, frightened at others, imperfect in ways Daniel understood because he was imperfect too. She loved their daughter. Daniel turned back. I want Emily to have both of us. Melissa lifted her eyes. I don't want her believing she has to love one parent less to protect the other. Daniel swallowed. I want the adults to carry the consequences of what the adults did. The courtroom remained quiet. I don't want our fear deciding which parent she's allowed to love. Judge Holloway did not award Daniel primary physical custody. Instead, she ordered a graduated parenting plan. Daniel received expanded weekends in Sandpoint, overnight visits, additional holiday time, and shared participation in major educational and medical decisions. If he maintained housing, employment, and compliance with the plan, the schedule could expand again after review. It was not the victory Daniel once imagined. It was better. It was something he could build upon. Outside the courthouse, Frank waited with Max while Emily stood beside him. The moment Max saw her, he tried to hurry across the walkway. His hind leg slipped beneath him. Max. Daniel moved forward. Emily reached him first. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around the old German shepherd's neck. Max leaned against her. You don't have to run. Emily whispered. She kissed the gray fur between his ears. I'm here. Daniel stopped several feet away. The words entered somewhere deeper than he expected. For years, he had run from grief, from Robert, from paperwork, from shame, and finally from the possibility that he could still disappoint everyone he loved. Max looked back at him. Emily kept one arm around the dog and held the other hand toward her father. Daniel walked to them. No one asked him to hurry. For the first time in years, he didn't. 6 months after Daniel returned to Sandpoint, spring moved across Lake Pend Oreille slowly, melting the last snow from the shaded banks and laying green over the mountains that had once seemed cold enough to keep every old memory frozen forever. Robert's shop was alive again, not transformed, not polished into some grand success story, simply alive. Daniel repaired small fishing boats, restored wooden hulls that larger marinas considered too troublesome, and still worked several days a week on dock maintenance. A few of Robert's old customers returned after hearing his son had reopened the doors. Others came because Frank apparently considered privacy a personal insult and had told half of Bonner County that Daniel could repair anything except his own personality. The money was modest but predictable. Taxes were being paid. The remaining property issues were moving toward resolution. For the first time in years, Daniel could look at the next month without wondering where he and Max would sleep. Emily stayed more often now under the expanded parenting schedule. Nothing had been magically erased. Melissa remained part of her life, as Daniel wanted, and there were still awkward handoffs and decisions requiring more patience than either parent naturally possessed. But Emily's upstairs bedroom no longer looked prepared for a visitor. Jeans hung in the closet. 3 paperback novels lay open in different places because she insisted she was reading all of them. A blue toothbrush leaned beside Daniel's. On the kitchen shelf sat a ceramic mug with Emily painted crookedly across it. Daniel had spent years believing a home was proved by a deed or address. He now suspected it was proved by things nobody bothered taking away between visits. Max was the one part of spring Daniel wished he could slow down. The 9-year-old German Shepherd responded well to treatment, but medicine could ease age without negotiating with it. Gray had spread farther across his muzzle. He no longer jumped into the Tahoe, so Daniel lifted his hindquarters while Max placed his front paws on the seat, both pretending the arrangement was not humiliating. Running down the dock had become walking. Some mornings Max needed several attempts to stand, yet he maintained one ritual with military seriousness. Every night he climbed upstairs, checked Emily's doorway, returned downstairs to inspect the shop entrance, then settled outside Daniel's room. Daniel never taught him that routine. One night, Daniel woke shortly after 2 and found the hallway empty. Max. No caller answered from the darkness. Daniel checked Emily first. She was asleep, one arm hanging from the bed, safe. He found Max outside at the end of the dock. The old dog sat facing the lake beneath a sky crowded with stars. Daniel approached without calling him. Max heard anyway. One ear turned back. Daniel lowered himself beside him with considerable negotiation from his left knee. "Look at us." Max glanced over. One retired SEAL with a bad knee and one retired working dog with 2 bad hips. Max slowly lowered himself and rested his head across Daniel's thigh. Strong team. The lake moved quietly beneath them. Daniel thought of Mikey. For years, the first image had always been Afghanistan. The last mission, the missing voice. All the questions Daniel had turned into punishments. Tonight, another image came first. Mikey on Robert's dock wearing that ridiculous straw hat, laughing with a beer in his hand. Daniel smiled. That mattered. Then he thought about Robert sitting outside this same shop on Saturday afternoons, looking up whenever tires touched gravel. Once, that memory would have crushed him. Now, grief arrived differently. It still hurt. Daniel hoped it always would, at least a little. Love without any ache afterward seemed impossible, but pain was no longer the proof that he remembered. "I get it now, Dad," he whispered. Max's ear moved. "Not you." Max sighed. Daniel scratched beneath his collar. "Though, apparently, you get everything." For years, Daniel had believed the men who came home carried an obligation to those who did not. He had confused remembering them with remaining wounded for them. Robert's recording had broken something open inside him. The veterans group had helped him name the rest. The dead did not need the living to die slowly beside them. Remembering could also look like breakfast with your daughter, work, laughter, a dog asleep in sunlight. The next morning, Emily announced she was making pancakes. Daniel discovered too late that this meant he was cleaning the kitchen. She placed 1 pancake on her plate, 2 on Daniel's, then produced a smaller one and set it in Max's bowl. Daniel stared. No. Emily looked innocent. What? He's a dog. He saved your life. That does not grant pancake citizenship. He's family. Before Daniel could construct a constitutional argument, Max swallowed most of the pancake. Daniel pointed at him. Traitor! Emily laughed so hard she nearly dropped the syrup. Max searched the floor for additional evidence. The sound filled the apartment and traveled down into Robert's workshop. Daniel stopped for half a second. His father had waited so many Saturdays for his son's truck. Now his granddaughter's laughter lived above his tools. Maybe some endings arrived too late for the people who started them. That afternoon, Emily was looking through a box of Max's old equipment when she found the scratched metal tag from his previous collar. "Dad?" Daniel looked up from an invoice. She read it aloud. "Max, bring him home." Her thumb traced the worn letters. "You made this." Daniel nodded. "When?" "Years ago." What did it mean? Daniel looked toward Max, asleep beneath Robert's workbench. "At first, I thought his job was to keep me grounded when things got bad." Emily frowned. "But he actually saved you from the crash." "Yeah." "So he brought you home twice?" Daniel smiled. Then his eyes traveled around the shop. Robert's photograph stood on one shelf. Beside it was the picture of Mikey in the straw hat. Upstairs were Emily's books, socks, toothbrush, and ridiculous personalized mug. Max slept beneath the bench wearing the collar Robert had bought for him, the tag underneath still carrying Robert's instruction, "Stay with him." Daniel shook his head. "More than twice, I think." He took the old tag from Emily and hung it carefully between Robert's photograph and Mikey's. "Bring him home." Before Daniel's first deployment, Robert had written almost the same words behind their photograph. "Bring my boy home." Back then, Daniel thought home meant America. Later, when everything fell apart, he thought home meant a building with his name attached to it. He understood differently now. A man could return to his country and remain lost for years. He could sleep beneath a roof and still have nowhere he belonged. He could survive a war without learning how to live after it. And sometimes home was not the place waiting at the end of the road. Sometimes it was what remained when a man finally stopped running. That evening, Daniel closed the shop after Emily had gone upstairs. Max rose slowly from beneath the workbench. Daniel could have reached the stairs first. He waited. "Come on, old man." Max looked at him. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, takes one to know one." They crossed the darkened shop together, neither moving quickly. At the stairs, Daniel glanced toward Robert's tools, Mikey's photograph, and the old metal tag hanging between two men he had once believed he needed to suffer in order to remember. He did not want his old life back anymore, not the old marriage, not the old house, not even the soldier he had been before Afghanistan. A second chance was not the return of everything lost. It was the courage to build something worthy from what remained. A small boat shop, a daughter who did not have to choose between her parents. A father Daniel could finally remember with forgiveness. A fallen friend who could exist in laughter again instead of only guilt. An aging German shepherd who still checked the doors every night. And a 44-year-old man who finally understood that being alive was not a debt he owed the dead. It was an opportunity. Daniel switched off the last light. Upstairs, Emily's nightlight glowed beneath her bedroom door. Max stood beside him. Daniel rested a hand on the old dog's head. "You can stand down, buddy." Max looked up at him. Daniel smiled. "You brought me home." And this time, when Daniel climbed the stairs, he knew exactly where he was going. Sometimes God's miracles don't come as something extraordinary. Sometimes they come as a second chance, a faithful dog who refuses to leave, or one more road leading us home. Daniel learned that surviving was not a debt to the people he lost. It was a gift, and perhaps the best way to honor them was to truly live again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, your family, our veterans, and every faithful companion who helps a lost soul find the way home. Amen.